What a blessing to have so much creativity. I love having our kids involved in every aspect of the worship service up until this moment. I honestly, if I were in your place, I would say, I have been blessed this morning. I feel like God has been worshiped. Let's go home before the snow. But I'll tell you what, if you'll promise to hang on for a few more minutes, I am going to talk about football and war. And I'll try and make it entertaining, okay? And I'll try and make sure there's a point as well. Doing all that is hard, but I'll try. Our kids, for those of you that are visiting this week or you haven't been here for a few weeks, our Pathfinder age kids have been involved in Bible Bowl, which is now called Pathfinder Bible Experience. And they've been studying and memorizing the books of Joshua and Judges since, well, some of them since probably November and some of them since last week. They're all coming together. They did very well in Las Vegas. They make a point of not telling us exactly how well they did, but they did well enough to advance to the next round. So they're going to go up against, not really against, but they're going to be there with teams from Hawaii and Arizona and California and Nevada and, as the whole Pacific Union comes together to see, it really is inspiring. There'll be 20 teams there, so like 120 kids who have a fairly equal memorization of the book of Joshua and Judges, which is, I said it last time, a month ago, I dare any of you to go up against them in their area, okay? So I am going to let them fill in the blanks in my talk this morning because they know the material better than I am, and I won't be surprised if they correct me once. But today, well, we're going to stay in the book of Judges, and we're going to examine a theme. In the next gen class, which is the 14 and up class, we're just starting what I would call a survey of the Bible, which is going through the Bible. This is our last chance with these kids before they're off in college. They're already in college, to be honest. But it's our last chance with them before they decide it's our last chance with them. And we're kind of wanting to go through and survey the Bible with the idea that if the Bible is the story of God, then what does everything in the Bible tell us about God? Why is it there? And I'll bet you can answer that for Genesis and for the Gospel of John. You might have a harder time with Nahum or Obadiah or some of the other books. So the idea is to go through it all at a fairly high rate of speed so that they see how it all fits together. And so we're constantly asking this question of, why is this in the Bible? And the book of Judges, why is this in the Bible? Last time we talked about one of the most horrific moments in the Bible, the vow of Japheth and the horrific consequences of that. And this time, we're going to talk about leadership. What does Judges tell us about what God's plan is for leadership? What is it? But first, I'm going to see if Kimmy can tell me, do you remember from the Andrews Bible Commentary, what is the main theme of the book, or the main topic of the book of Judges? Okay, leadership, right. It's leadership and the covenant. So it's this God and his people, the relationship with them, and how he raises up leaders and to restore the covenant. Okay, in my Bible commentary, this is the Mr. Dave's Bible commentary, I view Judges as a case study in leadership versus management. Okay, and that's something that appeals to me particularly because I spend a lot of my time during the week thinking about leadership versus management. So for example, the way I look at the Bible, generally speaking, kings are managers and judges are leaders. Now, a lot of you are going to say, no way, kings are leaders. They can be, no doubt about it. But they spend a lot of their time, they're called to be managers. They're called to maintain the kingdom, right? to, and especially if you look at it in the Old Testament context, people were always coming at them. And their job was really, a lot of times, if you think about the kings of Israel, it wasn't necessarily to expand the nation of Israel. It was to keep it from collapsing. Whereas in Judges, it was God is raising up people because the kingdom is collapsing. And so I'm going to make a contrast today between, by the way, both of these skills are critical at various points in time, to God and to us in everyday life. As a matter of fact, in business, a lot of times we will have discussions about, hey, we need to hire a new person to head up this department. Do we need a leader or a manager? Where are we in the life cycle of that business? Do we need somebody who will make sure that we maintain that business? The challenge is maintenance. Or do we need somebody who's going to, frankly, light it on fire and maybe even start over? And so to me, in the book of Judges, we see a lot of what does God do to take humans, some of them very flawed, as a matter of fact, I would argue most of them are flawed in some way, and turn them into leaders. What does he do? I'm going to give you an example of the contrast. So I would say, Mr. David, are you Dr. McGill now? The PhD, yeah, I'm going to call him Dr. McGill because I think he actually officially is. He gave us this very stark illustration of David and Goliath, right? If you think about the story of David and Goliath, Saul was a manager, David was a leader. Saul was sitting back behind the lines with the army going, I don't know how we're going to defeat these guys. I certainly can't figure out a way that we're going to go out and remember the challenge that Goliath was giving? Goliath was giving a challenge that said one-on-one combat. Whoever wins, the other nation will be the slaves of us. Right? So if Goliath wins, the Israelites are slaves. Boom, one and done. Right? If the champion of Israel wins, then the Philistines are slaves. So Saul is sitting back behind the lines going, I don't know how to preserve this kingdom. We can't beat that guy. And if we don't beat him, we're the slaves. David walks into camp and says, I'll fight him. Right? And he goes and does. Right? By the way, later in David's career, when he's the king, there are multiple incidents of where David is behaving like a manager. How do I preserve my kingdom? One of them is when he decides, this is not a very well-known story in the Bible, but he decides to number the people of Israel so that he can see how many warriors he has in his army. He wants to feel secure in his army, so he sends Joab, his general, out, and he says, number all the warriors. And Joab says, this is a bad idea. This is a bad idea. And sure enough, when he's done, God comes to David through the prophet and said, not a good idea. You're trying to be confident in yourself. You're trying to see, you're trying to do inventory. That's not leadership. So I want to, by the way, I saw Jonathan and Abby walk in, and I have to tell you that I'm going to start this off with a Super Bowl story. And so if you're a 49ers fan, buckle up, because we're going to rehash some painful memories. But yes, thank you, Micah. If you watched the last Super Bowl, you saw these two teams square off. And I will tell you the way I watched this game. I was riveted by this game. It was one of the best football games I've watched in a long time. But I was convinced at the end of the first period of play that the 49ers were done. Their goose was cooked. The Chiefs were done. The 49ers were all over them. Every time the 49ers touched the ball, they just went straight down the field. Somehow, they only scored a field goal. They only scored 3 points. So the score was only 3-0, but the Chiefs just could not move the ball. They had no offense. They were, as far as I was concerned, they were done. But somehow they stayed in the game. And the longer they stayed in the game, the more you started to think, they do have Patrick Mahomes. Now, Patrick Mahomes is the quarterback of the Chiefs, if you don't know. He's a very talented football player, and as a Broncos fan, I do not like the fact that he is a very talented football player because he plays my team twice a year and he destroys us twice a year. Okay, he is very, very, very good. And I remember one of the first sermons that Pastor Barry ever preached when he came to this church was after Patrick Mahomes had shattered his kneecap and was on the injured reserve list for 4 weeks. And Pastor Barry preached a sermon where he said, you know, I know I'm not supposed to be happy that he's on the injured reserve list, but I'm happy that he broke his kneecap, right? He was obviously making a bigger point than that, but nonetheless, he's a guy who's very talented, and as this game went along, I remember when it went into overtime as a tie, I was absolutely convinced that the Chiefs were going to win. Whereas in the first period, I was absolutely convinced there was no way they could win. And I just remember there was a play late in overtime where, you know, they had to get it was like 3rd and 12 or something like that. And I was just sitting there going, Patrick Mahomes is going to take this ball and he's going to run it himself and he's going to get the first down. And he did exactly that. You know, and I just, and you know, the game played out that the Chiefs won and Patrick Mahomes and his family went to Disneyland, as they all do. And I just remember going away from that thinking, no matter how much I don't like to see that guy succeed because he's on the other team, man, when the going gets tough, he lifted everybody and carried it down, you know. And I'm not saying there weren't, 10 other players on the team with him, on the field with him, but he got something done. So I want to tell you the story of, let's see, Micah, skip 2 ahead here, or 1, let's see. There we go. This is Super Bowl 54 BCE at the glamorous springs of Herod. And this is the story of the Israelite farmers versus the nomadic hordes of the East. Okay, this is Super Bowl level stuff. And the story we're going to talk about is in Judges 6 through 8. It is the story of Gideon. It is one that is very familiar to you. So if you want to get out your Bible, look at it in Judges 6 through 8. We're going to talk about this because this is exactly what was going on. Okay? What was going on is the Israelites under Joshua had come into Canaan and they had conquered enough of the other tribes that Israel had gone from being the nomads who were a thorn in everybody's side to being the farmers. Okay, they had moved in, they had settled, they had planted wheat, and it says in this story that basically what would happen is every year when they harvested their grain and they tried to bring in the harvest, the Midianites and the Amalekites and the tribes of the east would come storming in and take all their food and go away. And it would leave them impoverished, poor, starving, and it talks about the fact that they didn't have enough food to feed their cattle, et cetera, et cetera. Okay? And this happened every year at harvest time. So the story begins with Gideon threshing wheat, and Ansel corrected me on this last time. He was threshing wheat in the wine press because that's the last place the ravening hordes would expect somebody to be processing their grain at harvest time. He was trying to hide out, get a little food processed, and get it put away when the angel of the Lord shows up. Okay? And I'm not going to go through the whole story, but I'm just going to go through some important moments. So first of all, I want you to know something. We talked about this in Next Gen Sabbath School this morning. It says the Midianites were the tribe that dominated Israel during this time. Okay? Just so you know, the Midianites, there was a dude named Midian, and he was Esau's grandson. Okay? So the Midianites are cousins of the Israelites. Okay? Israelites come from Jacob. Midianites come from Esau. Okay? On top of that, it talks about the Amalekites. The Amalekites are even closer relations. In the Bible, in Genesis 25, little known fact, after Sarah died, Abraham married somebody else, and one of the children he had with that wife was called Amalek. Right? So these are all cousins of the Israelites. As a matter of fact, if you go back and you look at the the genealogy, the history after the flood, when you go through and it talks about who were the children of Shem, Ham, and Japheth after the flood, the Canaanites, the Philistines, all these people that the Israelites had just booted out of Canaan were all their cousins, right? These guys are all related. And it just so happens that the Israelites had come in as the new nomads and said, we're settling down, this is our land, God told us it's our land, and the other guys were still out there nomading around. The Midianites, by the way, Moses' wife was a Midianite, right? These tribes are very closely related. And so these people come in, and God shows up to Gideon while he's hiding in the wine press, trying to process a little food. And whose story is it your story, Gideon? Whose story is Gideon? All right, Anzar, okay. So what did the angel of the Lord call Gideon the first time he met him? Yes. A mighty man of valor. He calls him, he says, hello, you mighty man of valor, right? And as the story goes on, basically, if you read this story, read it offline. I'm not going to read it all to you, but it's a fascinating way God approaches Gideon, because he keeps calling him a mighty man of valor. And then Gideon says, well, you know, if you were really on our side, Lord, we wouldn't be oppressed by all these Midianites, and we wouldn't have all these problems. And what God says to Gideon, he says, well, something to the effect of, in your might, go do it. Go solve the problem, you mighty man of valor. Right? I just told you you're a mighty man of valor. Go do it. Right? And what ends up happening is Gideon realizes, I think a little bit, that he's being goaded into this, potentially something cataclysmic. And Gideon says, what does he say? I am from the tribe of Manasseh. Yeah, go ahead. My clan is the weakest in Manasseh, and I am what? The weakest in my father's house. So Gideon basically says, hang on, God, before this gets out of control. I am the wimpiest guy you could be talking to right now. I am in a small tribe, the half tribe of Manasseh, in the weakest clan, and I am the weakest dude in the clan. Right? So this is the way God begins this call of Gideon to be a leadership. But God keeps saying, basically, I will be with you. I am with you. I am going to go with you, right? So I'm saying you're mighty. You're saying you're weak. Don't worry about it. I am going to go with you, right? And he even goes so far as to say, you will defeat Midian as one man. There's some debate whether that means he's going to unify Israel as if it was one man or what. But nonetheless, you are going to go do something amazing. And then, by the way, there's this whole thing where Gideon must have kind of accepted the challenge, because God then says, okay, first thing you need to do if you're going to be my leader, first thing you need to do, go, your dad has an altar to Baal, and he has a Baal idol carved out of wood. Go chop down the Baal idol, break it up into kindling, build a good altar to God, take your dad's second best bull and sacrifice and use Baal to make a fire to burn the sacrifice to me. Gideon, being a wimp, decides to do that in the middle of the night when nobody's watching, but he does it. And the next day, there's a whole thing, and basically, they change his name to Jerubbaal, which means let Baal contend. So from then on, Gideon's name is let Baal take care of himself. If Baal can't keep himself from being chopped down and turned into kindling, that's his problem, right? So that's Gideon's new name. And it's only after all that happens that he does the thing with the fleece. You know the thing with the fleece? Anybody not know the thing with the fleece? Okay, good. You all know the thing with the fleece. So after that, he does the thing with the fleece. I would have thought, I'd have been like, God, I got to do the fleece thing first to prove that you're with me before I chop down the idol that's going to make everybody mad at me. But no, he goes and chops down the idol, and then he decides, I need to see if God's with me, okay? And then, you probably know the story. He decides that God is actually with him. He's going to do the thing. He raises up an army of 32,000 men and says, okay, I'm going to go do this thing, God. Now, the Midianites were a noticeably larger army. 32,000 men wasn't really probably enough to do the job. But at this point, Gideon is still thinking like a manager, right? I need a lot of guys. I need to get swords for them all. I need to make sure they have food. Oh, yeah, I need to make sure they have water. Let's go down to the stream. Let's get a drink of water before we go into battle. And you know what happens, right? On the very eve of the battle, on the very, the day before the battle, they take all these guys, 32,000 people, down to the stream to get a drink of water. And God says, you're only allowed, everybody who laps like a dog stays in the army, and everybody who basically does this goes home. And so his army goes from 32,000 to 300 in one shot. Now, I don't know about you, but if I was a leader and I was in charge of that army, at that point I would seriously consider quitting, right? I mean, God said he would be with me, but did you see how many tents those guys have down there? Did you see how many camels and horses they rode in on? I got 300 guys, but there's nothing about that in the book of Judges, right? There is no going back to God and Gideon or Jerubbaal now saying, yeah, I don't know, God, you said you're with me, but. So the wimpiest guy there is, the wimpiest guy that God could have talked to in that moment, God has stripped him down. And he is a leader. He has no choice. He has to be a leader at this point. Because I got to believe, can you imagine, even if Gideon didn't question God, can you imagine the 300 soldiers that are left? Right, going, what do you mean you sent the other 31,700 guys home? What are you talking about? What is your plan here, right? So he's going to have everybody questioning his leadership, and somehow the story goes on that it's Gideon and 300 people going to war. And Gideon still isn't quite convinced, so there's a little bit of the story where God tells him to go down into the Midianite camp at night and listen to the soldiers through the tent walls. And he hears the soldiers telling, hey, I had a dream. And the dream basically was to the effect that Gideon and his army were going to wipe them out. And so in the middle of the night, the battle occurs. And surprise, 300 men jump out with torches lighted, and the Midianites and the Amalekites are so confused that it says, and I'm sure God had something to do with that they killed each other, okay? The interesting thing is that's not the end of the story, because what ends up happening is Gideon takes his 300 men and he continues to pursue the fleeing army, what's left of it. And it says he pursued them across the Jordan, and he kept pursuing them. And it says his army was exhausted. It says his army of 300 men. So right, nobody else had rejoined the army. It's Gideon and the original 300, and it says they were exhausted. And they kept chasing the enemy. And they kept asking cities as they went by for food, and they kept being refused food and water. And so Gideon would just say, don't worry, I'm coming back to deal with you. But he kept pursuing with 300 men. And he fought a second battle, 300 versus 10,000. And it says the Midianites, there were 10,000 of them, and they were resting. So it seems like we always are catching these Midianites sleeping or taking a nap. And he beats them. How many? 15,000, sorry. See, I knew he would. 300 against 15,000, and he beats them again. So this is, and by the way, when all of this wraps up and Gideon comes home, and oh, by the way, on his way home from the battle, he does deal very harshly with those cities who would not give him food and water on the way. But he finally comes back, and when the people say, you and your sons should rule over us, we want to make you the king, Gideon basically says, I did my job, it's done. Neither I nor my sons will rule over you. It's like George Washington, resigning from being general of the army after the American Revolution, right? I did my job. If you want a manager, hire a manager. I did my job. I did what God called me to do. And I find this story really, what's not said is almost as fascinating to me as what is said. All the things where you're like, I gotta believe those 300 soldiers had a very stern conversation with Gideon right about there, right? All that stuff's not talked about. It's just an incredible story. And I think about all these leadership moments, and there are plenty of them in Judges, and they all have different outcomes. So they're all different stories about leadership. But I think about Patrick Mahomes and the Kansas City Chiefs. What really inspires me about that story more than anything is that the Kansas City Chiefs were not good last year. They were not great. Would you agree, Josh? I think they squeaked into the playoffs. They had to play all their games on the road in the playoffs. Every game was like, well, they're on the road. They're playing the Baltimore Ravens. I mean, this is the end. And every time they came up big. And at the end, when they were celebrating after the Super Bowl, one of the conversations they were having with multiple of the players was why this was such a big moment for them. And they basically said this, okay? I'm going to summarize in a nutshell. No football team has ever won 3 Super Bowls in a row. We had to win the second to have a chance at the third. So they had just won their second in a row. And I thought, what an audacious goal for a team that wasn't that good. That is a goal where once you state it, everybody on the planet is out to knock you off, right? Every team they play next year is going to come in there and go, we're going to make sure you don't become the first team ever to win 3 Super Bowls in a row. And that's one of the things that strikes me about leadership. And I kind of would retitle this sermon, Gideon, Patrick Mahomes, and God. Is one of the things that strikes me about leadership, and I've always found this to be true, is that one of the things that, generally speaking, distinguishes leaders from managers, I would say, and both are called for a different purpose. But one of the things that distinguishes leaders is they, generally speaking, are called and call on others to embrace a goal that has a high probability of loss. You don't go in as a leader and say, hey guys, I'm taking over this business, and our goal is this time next year, our business is exactly as successful as it was last year. We're just going to try and hang on and be just as good as we were last year. Right? Leaders usually are the ones that are brought in to say, we're going to blow everything up because last year wasn't nearly good enough. There is a bigger goal. And usually those goals do not occur without a high probability of loss. If you think about the judges of Israel, if you think about Deborah and Barak, Deborah being the judge, Barak was just the general, they were called to lead an army of farmers into battle against 900 iron chariots. An iron chariot, all they have to do is get going, and they don't even need to chop you up with a sword. They just run you over and you're dead, right? That just wasn't something you did. There was a high probability in an earthly sense that they could lose. Think about in the New Testament, think about the story Jesus told of the servants with the talents, right? Somebody gets 5 talents, somebody gets 3, somebody gets 1. At the end, the guy who got 5 turned him into 10, the guy who got 3 turned him into 6, and the guy who got 1 said, Yeah, I knew you were really careful, so I just buried it in the ground. Which one didn't get any credit for doing his job well? The guy who buried it in the ground. The ones who risked it, who went out and said, hey, I'm going to figure out how to do something great with what I've been given. I'm going to double this. Those are the ones that got rewarded by the master. I wanted to show you something. This is, Micah, if you could show the next slide. I apologize, I'm going to bring a little bit of secular business into this conversation. Here. So most of you, this won't resonate with you, but this is, this is a slide I took from a venture capital group. This is VC, venture capital. So venture capitalists are people that invest in smaller companies to give them the money they need to go out and build their business, right? Most businesses don't say, hey, I got a great idea. I'm going to open a sandwich shop, and I just happen to have $100,000 sitting in the bank, right? Most people have to get the money from somewhere, and venture capitalists are the type of people that provide it. This is a graph that says this is what happens to, radio interference. This is what happens to most companies that start out small, take some money to succeed. Most of those companies don't even get back 1x, meaning they don't even get back the money that was invested. Right? 1x means I put $1 into your business, you gave me $1 back. Congratulations. Most of them don't even do that. Okay? And if you get way out here, almost none of them get 5 or 10x return or 100x return, right? The reason we focus on this is because venture capitalists basically, when they give you money, they basically say, I'm gonna give 100 companies some money. Only one of them is gonna be a big winner. The rest of you fail and fail fast and go out of business because I'm counting on the one. I'm counting on the one who returned 100x. Google, we always say, returned the fund, meaning all the money for that venture capitalist that they got paid back came from Google. Everybody else failed, at best returned the money that they were given. And so there's this old adage of if you're starting a business and you're using capital from a professional investor, fail and fail. If you're going to fail, fail fast. But try to fail. Right? You get no points. You get 0 points in this world for saying, well, I wasn't sure we could succeed, so I took the $1 million you gave me and I was really careful with it, and at the end of the year I had $980,000 left. In this world, that's automatic termination of services. You're fired. You didn't do what we wanted you to do. So this is another way of looking at what is called when Gideon is called on. When Gideon is called on to go out and do this thing, and he raises an army of 32,000 people, God says, I'm going to strip you down to 300. Because when this thing is done, Zara is telling me it went from 32,000 down to 22,000, then down to 300. She's right, of course. But nonetheless, in the end, he had 300. God was making it very clear, and he says it in the book of Judges. You're either going to fail spectacularly, or everybody's going to know God won this for you. And I tell you this because, this story is very poignant for me because I have been a lifelong denominational Christian, meaning I have spent my entire life in denominational churches. This is one, right? And one of the challenges that denominational churches have is that once they get to the point that they're a denominational church, most of what they have to do is not fail. Most of what a big church with 25 million worldwide members has to do is not get smaller. not fail, not risk something. And that's a challenge for me personally. I find myself constantly at odds with that mentality because I hear it a lot. I hear, hey, if God wants to do something great with us, he's going to do it. Our job is to make sure we don't lose. And I think the book of Judges points out over and over again that there are moments where God says, I have to call somebody who is willing to lose, who is willing to contemplate dying, who is willing to contemplate losing everything and looking like a fool. And I have to sometimes have that person in charge. Both have a role. I say this because there's a couple reasons. One is, as a body of Christians, I would challenge us all that as a group of Christians, as a community of Christians, when somebody asks you or asks me, hey, would you be willing to do X, Y, and Z for the church? Consider whether God's calling you to be a leader or a manager. Consider whether God is calling you to do something that's never been done before. Or is God calling you, as he will do, to say, I need somebody to take over and shepherd this flock that already exists, or shepherd this ministry that already exists. I would say every church needs both. And the day the church says, hey, we just don't want to lose what we got, is the day a church stops doing great things. And the last thing I want to leave you with, because it is 12:25 and the snow will be starting soon, is I would ask you to reflect on the life of Jesus, because the life of Jesus, if you look at it, is the ultimate story of this kind of leadership. You know, there are some Christian faiths who believe that Jesus' role was to come to this earth to be a role model, to show us that it was possible to live a Christian, a sinless life, to be a great moral leader. And certainly that kind of leadership has some risk of loss. But we believe, and the Bible tells us, that Jesus came. I love the way C.S. Lewis says it. He said, I think it's in Mere Christianity. I could be wrong. Michael will correct me because he's the expert on C.S. Lewis. But he says something to the effect of, you either believe Jesus is who he says he is, or he is a lunatic and a madman. He doesn't give you any other choice. Jesus says, I am the Son of God. And Jesus, you either believe he is, or he's loopy. He's crazy, right? Jesus didn't come into this earth and say, hey, I'm going to make myself palatable to you. He came to this earth and he said, I got a mission. And as Paul describes it in Philippians, he says his mission, he gave up everything. He gave up everything. The loss started the day he showed up. He gave up everything to undertake a mission where the forces of hell were arrayed against him his whole life. One slip and his mission to redeem humanity was done. That's the kind of leader God was calling Gideon to be. That's the kind of leader God may be calling you to be. And I hope that this church is full of all kinds of gifted people. Those who are great at being custodians of what God has given, and those who are willing to accept a challenge and embrace loss and embrace risk to do something great for God. Let's pray. Heavenly Father, we are grateful to have so many inspiring stories in the Bible. Thank you for not just making the Bible something where we're told a bunch of facts. about you, but that we get to see in humans that are just as flawed and weak as we are what you can do with us. Thank you for the example of Jesus who gave up everything for us, took every risk. Thank you that he succeeded. As we go out this week, I ask that you will charge us all with a sense of fire and passion to go do something great for you. Help us to find what those things are. Young people are just starting on that journey. Help them to find those things that give them a great calling. I ask this all in your name this morning. Amen.